Evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward, here, tell me, has your fire burned low tonight, the room settling into that particular hush before sleep? Watson often wrote in such hours, when ash and embers held their own quiet evidence. Do subscribe, so these margins remain open to you. Now draw nearer, for as Holmes maintained, it is upon trifles that the greatest cases turn. Find us also on Spotify. Watson's Margins, link in the description below. Chapter 1, The House at Blackthorn Crescent. It was, I recall, the second week of November, when the fogs lay so heavily upon London that the lamps along Baker Street burned a sickly yellow from morning until night, and a man might lose his way between one doorstep and the next. My friend Sherlock Holmes had for some days drawn into one of those periods of restless inactivity, which I had come to recognise as preludes to either profound melancholy or, more happily, to some new and absorbing problem. He had filled the intervening hours with a monograph upon the wax seals employed by ecclesiastical and manorial courts during the 14th century, a subject which he pursued with as much fervour as he had once brought to the analysis of cigar ash, and our sitting room had become so cluttered with crumbling parchments and reference volumes that Mrs. Hudson's had twice threatened, in her quiet way, to refuse us breakfast until some order was restored. I was seated by the fire that morning, attempting to read the Telegraph through the haze of Holmes's pipe smoke, when a sharp rap sounded upon the street door below, followed by the murmur of voices and a hurried tread upon the stair. "A client, Watson," said Holmes, without looking up from his work, "and an anxious one, if I am any judge of a footstep. Listen to the irregularity of his pace. He pauses, then hastens, then pauses again, man rehearsing what he means to say, and finding the words inadequate each time he tries them." The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson announced Mr. Adrian Fellwood. He was a small, precise gentleman of perhaps 55, dressed with the sober neatness one expects of a country solicitor. His collar was wilted, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, trembled very slightly. He bowed to us both, and accepted the chair which Holmes indicated, though he perched upon its edge, as though unwilling to commit himself to comfort. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I must apologise for this intrusion, but I find myself in a position where I scarcely know to whom else I might turn. Host. I am a solicitor practising in the town of Endersley, in Surrey, and I have come to you upon a matter connected with the death of one of my clients, Mr. Edmund Vale of Blackthorn Hall." Pray continue," said Holmes, settling back into his chair with that air of lazy attention which I had long since learned concealed the keenest interest. "You spoke of a death. Was it sudden? Sudden, and yet not entirely unexpected, given the gentleman's age and habits. He was found 3 nights ago in his study, collapsed before the hearth, the apparent victim of a seizure of the heart. There had been a small fire, nothing of consequence in itself. Few papers caught the grate, and some smoke discoloured the ceiling. But it was contained before any real damage was done to the room, or its furnishings. And yet you have travelled to London upon a winter's morning to consult me regarding what appears, by your own account, natural death and a trifling fire," said Holmes. "There is something more, Mr. Fellwood." The solicitor's hands tightened upon the brim of his hat. "There is, Mr. Holmes. Among the papers which the fire consumed entirely, I should say, for nothing remains of it but a few blackened fragments, was a mortgage deed of very considerable importance, bound the estate of a neighbouring family, the Harburys, to Mr. Vale's financial control, and its destruction coming as it did upon the very eve of a registration renewal, may render the debt unenforceable. I do not say this is the cause of Mr. Vale's death. I say only that it is a very singular coincidence, and that I do not care for singular coincidences. Nor do I, said Holmes quietly. Tell me something of Mr. Vale himself. He was a moneylender, sir. Though he would have bristled at the term, he preferred to be thought of as a benefactor to those in financial distress. He purchased debts, often quietly, often at a discount from creditors eager to be rid of them, and he was, I confess, exceedingly patient in calling them in. Patient, exceedingly thorough. More than one family in the district owes its present difficulties to arrangements which Mr. Coast. Vale was careful to keep within the strict letter of the law, however far they strayed from its spirit. A man, then, who might have made enemies. A man who had made nothing else, Mr. Holmes, though he had also, it must be said, reputation in the village for charity. To the church roof, baskets at Christmas, that sort of thing. He was not without his defenders. Good. Holmes rose and walked to the window where he stood for a moment, looking down into the grey street. Who comprises the household at Blackthorn Hall? There is Miss Clara Vale, his niece, kept his house these 5 years, and stands to inherit a considerable portion of his estate. There is Major Stephen Harbury, retired officer, and old friend of the family, though it is his own family's estate, which the burned mortgage concerned. There is the Reverend Elias Brooke, the vicar of the parish, who I believe was himself indebted to Mr. Vale upon a smaller matter. And there is Mr. Vale's secretary, Nathan Wills, a quiet young man who has managed his correspondence and accounts these 4 years past. The housekeeper, Mrs. Greaves, completes the household, along with 2 maids and a groom. And the local police? Inspector Bradstreet has been summoned from the county constabulary, but I understand he inclines toward the view that the matter is straightforward. A natural death, an accidental fire, nothing more. It is precisely because the matter appears so straightforward, Mr. Holmes, that I find myself uneasy. I have practised law for 30 years, and I have learned to distrust those explanations which arrive too neatly, too soon. Holmes turned from the window with the brisk, decisive air I knew so well. You have done well to come to me, Mr. Felwood, though I make no promises as to what I may find. Watson, I think we shall want our coats. There is a train from Waterloo within the hour, if I am not mistaken, and I confess that a few days in the Surrey air would be a welcome change from London fog and 14th century seals. We reached Blackthorn Hall as the early winter dusk was settling over the grounds. A handsome but sombre house of grey stone, set among bare elms, with a gravel drive curving up from iron gates. The household had been forewarned of our coming, and we were received with a cooperation that struck me, even then, as somewhat excessive in its eagerness. Miss Clara Vale, composed young woman with watchful dark eyes, conducted us herself to the study where her uncle had died, while Major Harbury, Mr. Wills, and the Reverend Brooke hovered in the hall behind her, each offering some small word of welcome, each, it seemed to me, anxious that Holmes should see the matter settled with the least possible delay. The study itself was a handsome room, lined with bookshelves, and dominated by a great mahogany desk. The hearth where the fire had occurred showed only a faint discoloration upon the surrounding stone, and the grate had been swept clean. Holmes stood for some minutes in the centre of the room, turning slowly upon his heel, his eyes moving over every surface with that peculiar intensity which I had seen him bring to bear upon 100 such scenes. "It is a very tidy room, Watson," he said at last, in a low voice meant for my ears alone. A very tidy room indeed, for one in which a man died only 3 nights ago. Surely that speaks well of the household's care, I ventured. Or of something else entirely, said Holmes. And though he said no more upon the subject that evening, I observed that he knelt for a long moment beside the hearth, and that when he rose again, there was upon his face that look of quiet, contained excitement which I had learned, over the years, to value above almost any other expression of the human countenance. A room may be tidier after a crime than before it, my dear Watson, he murmured, as we were shown to our rooms that night. Disorder is often honest. Chapter 2, The Character of Edmund Vale. The morning broke clear and cold, with a hard white frost lying upon the lawns of Blackthorn Hall, and a sky of pale, washed blue overhead. I came down to find Holmes already at breakfast, though he had eaten little, and a great pile of correspondence and ledgers stood at his elbow, brought to him, as Mrs. Greaves informed me with some disapproval, at his own request the previous evening, from the late Mr. Vale's strong box. "Sit down, Watson, and have some of this excellent ham," said he, "and tell me what you make of a man who writes thus." He passed me a sheet of paper, covered in a small, cramped hand, every line of which was filled to the margin, every figure entered with the same meticulous, joyless precision. "Careful man," I said. "An orderly one. I should say a man who trusted nothing to memory. Just so, and observe. Here, and here again. The dates upon which certain payments fell due, and the dates upon which they were in fact exacted, always a little later than the agreement specified. Never so much later as to constitute a breach which might be brought before a magistrate, always enough to accumulate a further charge. It is done so regularly, Watson, that it cannot be accident. It is a system, moneylender's system, I said, with some distaste. A moneylender's system practised with the patience of a spider, Holmes corrected. I have spent the early hours going through 5 years of Mr. Vale's correspondence, and I begin to form a very clear picture of the man. He was not a villain in any melodramatic sense. No threats, no violence, nothing that the law could touch. He was something colder than that. He found men and women at the moment of their greatest need, and he offered them relief upon terms which seemed generous, and which became, by slow and legal degrees, a kind of bondage. And the Harburys? The Harburys are perhaps the clearest case of all. Major Harbury's father borrowed against the estate some 15 years ago, to meet a debt of honour incurred by an elder son since dead. The sum was not large, yet by its a series of renewals, each accompanied by some small additional charge for Mr. Vale's trouble, debt has nearly trebled, while the estate itself has steadily declined in value through neglect that the family could no longer afford to remedy. Had the mortgage deed survived to its registration renewal next month, I have no doubt that Mr. Vale intended to call it in entire. The Harburys would have been ruined within the 12-month. Then the destruction of that deed is a piece of singular good fortune for the Major. "'Tis," said Holmes, "which is precisely why do I trust good fortune that arrives so conveniently, and so soon after a man's death." He rose and walked to the window, looking out across the frosted lawn toward a low stone wall, beyond which I could see the grey line of a river winding through bare willows. "I think, Watson, that we shall walk a little this morning, form the acquaintance of the household at our leisure." We found Major Harbury in the gun-room, cleaning a fowling piece with the absorbed attention of a man glad of some occupation for his hands. He was a tall, weathered gentleman of past 60, with a soldier's bearing, somewhat diminished by care, and he greeted us though I observed a certain wariness behind his courtesy. "Bad business, gentlemen," said he, when Holmes had introduced the purpose of our visit. "Vale and I were never friends, I will not pretend it, but I would not have wished this upon him. A man does not wish his creditor dead, Mr. Holmes. It solves nothing, and it looks a great deal worse than it solves." "You knew him well, then?" "As well as anyone in the parish, I suppose, which is to say not well at all. He was not a man who invited intimacy." The Major set down his gun and looked at us directly. "Will tell you plainly, since you are sure to learn it in any case. I came here on the night before he died. I asked him for more time. He refused me, as I had known he would, and I went home again." "At what hour did you leave?" "A little before 10, I should think. Wills can confirm it. He showed me out." Holmes thanked him, and we passed on to the morning room, where we found Miss Clara Vale at her needlework before the fire. She was, as Fellwood had described her, a composed and watchful young woman, though I thought I detected, beneath that composure, something of suppressed feeling. Whether grief or relief or some emotion less easily named, I could not at first determine. "You wish to ask me about my uncle, Mr. Holmes," said she, before he had spoken a word. "Will save you the trouble of delicacy. I do not think anyone in this house loved him, save perhaps Mr. Wills, and I am not certain even of that. But I did not wish him dead, and I certainly did not wish that dreadful fire, however small, frightened us all very badly. Can you describe his methods as you understood them?" "He believed that he was a benefactor," she said, faint bitter precision that put me in mind of her uncle's own ledgers. "He believed it quite sincerely, which made it worse, somehow, than if he had been simply greedy. He would speak of the Harburys, or the Pellingtons, or the Cross family, with what he called regret. 'Such a pity,' he would say, 'that people will not manage their affairs.' And all the while he held the means of their ruin in a drawer in that study, and took it out, from time to time, to remind himself that it was there. And yet he gave to the church, I am told, and to the poor of the parish at Christmas." "He did," said Miss Vale. And for the first time her composure wavered very slightly. "Fools! I have sometimes thought that he gave with one hand precisely, so that the other hand might take with a clearer conscience. But that is an uncharitable thought, Mr. Holmes, and I do not insist upon it. It was as we left her that I noticed, glancing back through the open door, that Nathan Wills had entered the room behind us, and that he stood very still in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes fixed upon some middle distance, until Miss Vale rose and spoke to him in a low voice, whereupon he started, as a man wakened suddenly. "Drew, you saw that, Watson?" said Holmes when we were alone in the corridor. The secretary seemed startled. He seemed a great deal more than startled. He seemed a man listening for his own name in a conversation. He could not afford to overhear. "We shall speak with Mr. Wills before the day is out. Let him wonder a little longer what we have learned." Paused at the head of the stair, looking down through a tall window toward the study below, and beyond it to a narrow path of pale gravel that ran from beneath that window, not toward the great front entrance where carriages drew up, but away through a gap in the hedge toward what I took to be the kitchen gardens. "That is curious," he said softly, half to himself. "A private way, Watson, for a very private man. I think we shall walk that path before we are very much a leads, and see where it leads." Chapter 3. Fire in the Study. After luncheon, which was a subdued affair, conducted largely in silence, broken only by the small civilities which English women of good breeding contrive to maintain even under the most trying circumstances, Holmes proposed that we should examine the study once more, this time with the assistance of Mrs. Greaves being the first to enter the room upon the night of the tragedy. She was a tall, gaunt woman of perhaps 60, iron-grey hair, drawn back severely from a face that might once have been handsome, that retained still a certain hardness of feature which I associated, rightly or wrongly, with long years of service in a difficult household. She answered Holmes's questions readily enough, though with a kind of guarded precision, as though she had rehearsed her account, and was determined to alter not one word of it. "It was a little after 11, sir," said she, "when I heard the glass go. I was in the housekeeper's room, which lies below and somewhat to the side of the study, and I heard quite distinctly the sound of breaking glass. And then, a moment after, what I took to be a fall, a heavy fall, as of a man going down all at once without trying to save himself." And you went up at once?" "I called to Sarah, the upstairs maid. We went up together. Mr. Vale never locked it of an evening, for he liked to be private, but not shut away, if you take my meaning, sir. We found him upon the floor, before the hearth, quite still, and there was a small fire burning, not the hearth fire, which had burned low, but a fire among some papers that had fallen, or been thrown, into the grate, and which had caught and was beginning to smoke badly. You put it out, I understand." "Sarah threw water from the flower vases upon it, sir, while I went to Mr. Vale. But it was too late for him. The doctor said after that his heart had failed, that he had likely been dead some minutes, before ever the fire was noticed." "And the broken glass, where was that?" For the first time Mrs. Greaves hesitated. "The window, sir, the lower pane, nearest the garden. It was broken inward, as though something had struck it from without." "Was anything found that might have caused such a breakage? Or a fallen branch?" "Nothing was found, sir," Spectre remarked upon it, but concluded that in the confusion, whatever had broken, the glass had likely been kicked aside, swept up with the rest. Holmes thanked her, and when she had withdrawn he stood for some time at the window in question, examining the new pane of glass which had been fitted in place of the broken one, and the frame surrounding it, with that minute and patient attention which I had seen him bestow, on other occasions, upon objects of far greater apparent significance. "There is glazier's putty here that has not yet hardened, Watson," said he, "which tells us only what we already knew, that the pane was replaced within the last few days. But observe the frame itself, here, upon the inner sill. Do you see these scratches?" I bent and looked, and saw indeed a series of fine parallel scratches upon the painted wood, such as might have been made by some hard object dragged across the surface. "A boot heel, perhaps," I hazarded, "in climbing through." "Or in climbing out," said Holmes. "But let us proceed in order, for I think the order of events is of the first importance here. Let us begin with the fire itself." He crossed to the hearth and knelt once more before it, and at his direction I knelt beside him, though I confess I could see little, but a clean-swept grate and a few flakes of grey ash that had escaped the housemaid's brush and lodged in the crevices of the stone surround. "Consider the position of these traces," said Holmes, indicating the scattered ash with the tip of his cane. "They lie here and here and here again, always toward the centre and front of the grate, never toward the back or the sides. Now, Watson, when papers are thrown carelessly into a fire that is already burning, what becomes of them? They fall as they are thrown, suppose, wherever they happen to land." "Precisely. They fall in disorder, and the fire, working upon them from below and from the sides where the flames already burn hottest, consumes them unevenly. A corner here, an edge there, according to how each sheet has come to rest. At base, but the traces, so far as they can be read at all, suggest a concentration, a mass of burning that occurred in one place, and was afterward disturbed, perhaps raked or scattered, so that fragments of it came to rest in these outlying positions. You mean that the papers were not thrown into the fire at all, but burned elsewhere, and the ashes brought here afterward? I mean that it is a possibility which the evidence does not exclude, and which the evidence of the surrounding bookshelves rather supports. Look here, Watson. This shelf stands not 3 feet from the hearth. Upon it are papers, account books, even a calendar of thin paper, none of which shows the smallest sign of scorching, though the smoke from even a small fire in an enclosed room must surely have touched them. A genuine accident, a fire that broke out and spread, however briefly, among loose papers near the hearth. Such a fire does not confine its effects with this particular tidiness. I rose, somewhat stiffly, looked about the room with new eyes. At the ordered shelves, the unmarked carpet, the single new pane of glass catching the cold afternoon light. Then what do you believe occurred? Holmes. He did not answer at once, but stood looking down into the grate with an expression I had come to know. Well, a kind of fierce, contained stillness, as of a hound that has caught, faint but unmistakable, the first thread of a scent. I believe, Watson, Mr. Edmund Vale died in this room, very possibly of the seizure which the doctor diagnosed, very possibly without any hand raised against him. But I believe also that someone entered this room afterward. Whether before or after his death, I cannot yet say, and that this person did not throw papers into an existing fire in panic or in haste. I believe this person built a fire here, deliberately, of materials brought from elsewhere, and arranged its remains with some care, in order that we should believe precisely what the local inspector has been so ready to believe, that a moneylender's most dangerous document perished by misadventure in the general confusion of his death. He turned to me, and his grey eyes had that bright, hard glitter which I associated always with the moment when a case ceased, for him, to be a puzzle and became instead a hunt. This was not destruction born of panic, said he, quietly. It was arrangement, careful and theatrical. And a man does not go to such trouble, Watson, to destroy a single document, unless that document's survival would have been very much more dangerous to him than its loss is likely to prove. Then we are looking, I said slowly, not for whoever caused Vale's death, if indeed anyone did, but for whoever wished that mortgage deed destroyed. We are looking for both, said Holmes. Though I confess I begin to suspect they may not, after all, be 2 questions but one. Consider, Watson, stood to gain by that deed's destruction. Major Harbury, most obviously, whose family's ruin it represented. Miss Vale, whose inheritance it complicated. By tying up so great a portion of the estate in claims against the neighbourhood. The Reverend Brooke, who, I am told, owed Vale some smaller sum, and who might have feared that his own private embarrassment lay recorded among those same papers, and Mr. Wills, who had access to every document in this house, and whose nervousness, when the deed is so much as mentioned, I find increasingly difficult to attribute merely to the natural agitation of a man who has lost his employer. 4 persons, then, each with some reason. 4 persons, each with some reason, Holmes. Agreed, which is precisely 4 more than I should like, this stage of an inquiry. We must narrow the field, Watson, and I think the narrowing will come not from motive. Motive is cheap, and every man and woman in this house has some, but from the small, stubborn facts that motive cannot alter. The scratches upon this sill, broken window, that no one troubled to ask more closely about. And whatever it was that built that fire and fed it and raked its ashes afterward into so deceptive a semblance of accident. He glanced once more toward the window, the gravel path beyond it, winding away through the frosted garden, and I saw upon his face the look of a man who has set himself a problem and does not intend to rest until he has solved it. "Tomorrow, Watson," said he, "we shall walk that path, but tonight, I think, we shall dine with the household, and listen rather more than we speak. There is a great deal, I fancy, that this house has not yet told us, and a great deal more that it does not yet know it has told us already." Chapter 4. Ashes and Signatures. Dinner. That evening was, as Holmes had predicted, an instructive occasion, though I confess that at the time I perceived in it little beyond than the ordinary discomforts of a household still under the shadow of bereavement. Table was laid with a formality that seemed, in the circumstances, almost painful. The good silver, the white cloth, careful arrangement of chairs, as though by maintaining these small observances the household might persuade itself that nothing irregular had occurred at all. Major Harbury spoke chiefly of the weather and of some difficulty with the drainage of his lower fields, in the manner of a man filling silence rather than addressing it. The Reverend Brooke, a round, mild gentleman with anxious blue eyes, ventured once or twice upon some remark of a consoling character, addressed to no one in particular, and each time allowed it to trail away unfinished. Miss Vale presided with a composure that I had begun to recognise as her habitual armour. Nathan Wills sat at the foot of the table, eating almost nothing, and speaking only when directly addressed. It was Holmes himself who broke, quite deliberately I think, into this careful silence. "I have been examining Mr. Vale's correspondence today," said he, in the tone of a man making polite conversation, "and I confess I am struck by the extraordinary order in which it is kept. 5 years of letters, Mr. Wills, each docketed and filed according to date and subject. It does you very great credit." Wills looked up, startled, and I saw the colour come and go in his thin face. "Mr. Vale was most particular, sir," he said after a moment. "He required that everything be kept so. And yet," Holmes continued in the same easy tone, "I find that the file relating to the Harbury mortgage contains nothing later than a copy of the renewal notice sent some 6 weeks ago. No correspondence since. No memorandum of the visit, which I understand Major Harbury paid to this house upon the night before Mr. Vale's death. Is that not somewhat irregular in a system kept with such particularity?" There was a silence at the table that seemed, to my ear, to last a good deal longer than the few seconds it can actually have occupied. Major Harbury's hand, I noticed, had gone quite still upon the stem of his wine-glass. I could not say, Mr. Holmes," Wills answered at last, his voice not quite steady. "Mr. Vale sometimes kept certain papers by him, rather than filing them at once. It was his habit, with matters of particular delicacy." "No doubt," said Holmes pleasantly, and turned the conversation to some other matter, so smoothly that I think only Wills, and perhaps Miss Vale, fully understood what had passed between them. But I observed that for the remainder of the meal Wills scarcely lifted his eyes from his plate, and that once, when a log shifted in the fire with a small sharp crack, he started so violently that his fork rang against the china. It was after the ladies had withdrawn. Though Miss Vale was, in this small household, the only lady to withdraw, and did so, I suspected, more from delicacy toward us than from any old-fashioned scruple of her own, that Holmes drew me aside, while the Major and the Vicar lingered over their port. "You marked his agitation, Watson?" I could scarcely have failed to. but surely it proves nothing in itself. The man has lost his employer under distressing circumstances, finds himself questioned by a famous detective at his own dinner table. I think I might start at a falling log myself in his position. Fair observation, and I do not discount it, said Holmes. Indeed, it is the very fairness of such alternative explanations that makes this case delicate. Nervousness alone proves nothing. But come, I have something to show you, gained from this afternoon's labours, which I think you will find rather more difficult to explain away. He led me to our room, where, upon a sheet of clean paper spread across the dressing table, lay a small fragment, scarcely larger than a thumbnail, of blackened, curling material, which I took at first for a scrap of burned leather. "This," said Holmes, "is a corner of the mortgage deed itself, or what remains of it. I recovered it this afternoon from beneath the fender, where it had lodged unnoticed, in a crevice too narrow for the housemaid's brush to reach. Bulk of the document is gone beyond recovery, reduced to the fine ash we observed in the grate. But this fragment escaped the worst of the burning, and it has, I think, a great deal to tell us." He took up his lens, bade me look through it at the fragment's edge. "You will observe," said he, "that the parchment is scorched black along one side, as we should expect. But here, along this other edge, do you see it, Watson? There is a discoloration of a different character entirely. Not black, pale, bluish grey, ground into the very fibres of the parchment, as though it had been compressed there before ever the fire touched it. I looked, saw indeed a faint bluish tinge, quite distinct from the surrounding char, clinging to the fibres in a manner that suggested, even to my unpractised eye, something other than the ordinary effects of smoke or flame. What is it? Clay, Watson, river clay, or I am very much mistaken. The same pale bluish clay one finds along the banks of slow streams upon a chalk subsoil, such as that river yonder, behind the kitchen gardens. And observe further. It is not merely a smear upon the surface, such as might result from the document having been laid upon a muddy table. It is pressed into the parchment, as though the document had been folded, while the clay was still wet, with considerable pressure, folded, Watson, and perhaps carried, wrapped, for some little time before ever it came near a flame. But what should a mortgage deed be doing near the river at all? Surely such a document would be kept under lock and key in this very room. "That," said Holmes, "precisely the question I intend to answer tomorrow. But I will tell you this much tonight, Watson, since I know your patience with half-confidences is not infinite. No one, not Mrs. Greaves, not Miss Vale, not even Mr. Felwood, who has acted for this family these many years, can tell me where, within this house, Mr. Vale kept his most sensitive papers. Strong box in this room contains a great deal, but it does not contain, and I think never did contain, the documents he most prized. A man of Mr. Vale's character, Watson, suspicious, secretive, accustomed to using the weaknesses of others against them, does not keep his most dangerous weapons where his own household might stumble upon them. He hides them. And I begin to suspect that he hid them somewhere very near that river, in some place known to perhaps one person only besides himself. Wills, I said. Wills handles every paper that passes through this house. Holmes agreed. And yet the file on the Harbury mortgage is incomplete in just the manner that suggests someone has been at pains to make it appear complete. There is one thing more, Watson, which I noticed only this evening, and which I confess puzzles me more than anything else in this curious affair. What is that? The man's penmanship, said Holmes slowly. I asked Mrs. Greaves this afternoon, for a specimen of Wills's hand, upon the pretext of comparing it with some marginal notes in Vale's account, books. She brought me a letter he had written only yesterday, a letter of condolence, intended for some relation of Mr. Vale's in the north, and it was written, Watson, in a hand as steady, as regular, as unhurried as any clerk's copybook. Now I ask you, have you ever known a man genuinely shaken by grief or by nervous illness to write a letter of any length without the smallest tremor, the smallest irregularity, creeping into his hand? I confess that I had not. Nor have I, said Holmes, folding the fragment carefully into a fresh paper and placing it in his pocket-book. A man's hand may betray him, Watson, quite as surely as his face, and sometimes a great deal more honestly, for very few men think to govern it. I think, tomorrow, we shall walk down to that river, and see what the bank may have to tell us that the house has been so careful to leave unsaid. Chapter 5. Homes among the villagers. I had expected, upon waking the following morning, we should proceed at once to the river bank of which Holmes had spoken. But I found him already breakfasted and dressed for walking, and disposed, it seemed, to postpone that particular errand. "The river will keep, Watson," said he in answer to my inquiry. "Clay does not dry overnight in this weather, and whatever traces are to be found there will be no fresher tomorrow than today. But a village, my dear fellow, is a more perishable thing altogether. Give the inhabitants of Endersley another day to settle their opinions into the comfortable shapes that opinions assume once a matter. Is thought closed, and I shall learn nothing from them but what they have agreed among themselves to believe. This morning, while the matter is still fresh and full of conflicting whispers, is the time to listen." We walked, accordingly, the better part of 2 miles along a frozen lane bordered by hedgerows white with rime, till we came to the village itself. A cluster of grey cottages about a green, with a squat Norman church at one end, and at the other a small general shop, whose window displayed, with a kind of touching optimism, a selection of Christmas wares some 6 weeks before their season. Holmes did not announce himself, nor did he make any direct inquiry into the affairs of Blackthorn Hall. Instead, he fell into conversation, first with the shopkeeper over the purchase of some tobacco, then with an old gardener clearing leaves from the churchyard path, then with 2 women drawing water at the village pump, who regarded the tall stranger with frank curiosity, and answered his easy questions with the readiness of those who seldom find so attentive a listener. I confess that I marvelled, as I had marvelled before, at the ease with which Holmes could shed the manner of the celebrated detective, and assume instead that of an idle gentleman, newly arrived, with nothing better to do than gossip away a cold morning. He asked after the fishing in the river, and the state of the roads and the health of old Mrs. Tyndall, who kept the post office, and woven so naturally into this tapestry of trivial inquiry, that I think none of his interlocutors ever quite perceived the pattern. He learned a very great deal indeed. They feared him, Watson, more than they ever respected him, he said to me, as we walked on toward the church. Heard the word charity used of Mr. Vale perhaps a dozen times this morning, and on every occasion it has been followed, after the smallest pause, by some qualification. Though, of course, or mind you, or whatever else might be said, that is not the manner in which a community speaks of a man it has loved. And the Harburys? The Harburys are spoken of with a kind of anxious sympathy that suggests their difficulties were common knowledge. The old woman at the pump told me, without my asking. You understand, merely as part of the general flow of village news. that Mr. Vale had let it be known, quite recently, that he intended to set matters straight with several families before Christmas. She did not know what this meant, precisely, but she knew that it had been said, and that it had caused a good deal of quiet alarm. Then Vale intended to call in his debts, so it would appear. And it is a curious thing, Watson, how often the threat of an action precipitates the action it threatens to forestall. Come. We have learned what the village has to teach us for one morning. And there is one further inquiry I wish to make before we return. He led me to a low building beside the church, half almshouse and half schoolroom, where the Reverend Brooke was at that hour engaged in the distribution of bread, and a thin but evidently welcome soup, to a queue of perhaps a dozen persons, mostly elderly, and mostly, I judged from their dress, the wives and widows of labouring men. We did not approach him at once, stood at a little distance, but stood at a little distance in the shelter of the churchyard wall, and watched Vicar moved among his small congregation with a gentleness that seemed entirely unfeigned. A word here, a hand laid upon a shoulder there, an inquiry, evidently sincere, after some absent grandchild's health. It was a scene of homely, unremarkable goodness, and I confess it moved me somewhat, coming as it did, after so much talk of debts and deceptions. Guilty conscience and a charitable instinct often occupy the same breast, Watson, said Holmes quietly, after we had watched some minutes in silence. I do not say that Mr. Brooke is guilty of anything more than the ordinary failings of an ordinary man placed in a difficult position, but I notice that he gives with a kind of urgency, as though the giving itself were necessary to him in some way that goes beyond mere Christian duty. A man does not labour so visibly at his own goodness, Watson, unless some part of him fears that the balance, examined too closely, might not stand in his favour. We did not, in the event, speak with the Reverend Brooke that morning, for Holmes professed himself satisfied. We turned back toward Blackthorn Hall as the brief winter daylight began already to lean toward afternoon. It was as upon our return, however, we came up the drive toward the side of the house nearest the servants' quarters, that Holmes made the discovery, which was, I think, prove the turning point of the whole inquiry, though I did not recognise it as such at the time. A back door stood open, giving on to a flagged passage where the household's outdoor boots and overshoes were kept upon a long rack, each pair set beneath a peg bearing its owner's name in Mrs. Greaves's careful hand. Holmes paused before this rack with every appearance of idle curiosity, and bent to examine, one after another, boots ranged along it. The groom's heavy working boots, the gardener's, a pair of stout little shoes belonging, I supposed, to one of the maids. Pale clay, Watson, he murmured, indicating a faint crusting upon the sole of the gardener's boot, such as one might expect upon the boots of a man who works daily about the grounds, crosses the river path a dozen times in a week without remark. This proves nothing, indeed. It proves rather the opposite of what we seek, for it shows that such clay is common enough hereabouts to occasion no comment. He moved along the rack, and stopped before its farther end, where stood a single pair of gentlemen's shoes, well made, of good leather, so highly polished that they seemed almost to glow in the dim light of the passage. "And these?" I asked. "Surely too fine for outdoor work." "Too fine and too clean," said Holmes, taking up one of the shoes and turning it carefully in his hands. He drew out his lens and bent over the welt, where the leather of the upper met the sole, and I saw him become suddenly very still. "Look here, Watson," along this seam where the polish has not quite reached. Do you see it? I looked and saw, lodged in the narrow crevice of the stitching, the faintest possible trace of the same pale, bluish clay we had found upon the burned fragment of the deed. "But whose shoes are these?" I asked. Even as I spoke, I felt the answer gathering like a shadow, at the edge of my understanding. Holmes set the shoe down upon the rack, precisely as he had found it, and straightened. "They are too small for the Major's foot, Watson, and too narrow for the gardener's," said he slowly. "Think, before we go much further, we had better ask Mrs. Greaves to whom they belong. But I confess I think I already know, and if I am right, then the man who wears these shoes has been a great deal nearer to that river, and a great deal more recently, than he has troubled to tell us." Chapter 6. Fear behind loyalty. Mrs. Greaves, when applied to, identified the shoes without hesitation as belonging to Mr. Wills, and added, in the tone of one offering an unremarkable fact, that he had taken to wearing his second-best pair of late, the better having been sent to the village cobbler for a new heel, only the week before Mr. Vale's death, and not yet returned. "He is most particular about his appearance, sir," she said, "more so, if I may say it, than his station strictly requires. Mr. Vale used to remark upon it himself, sometimes not unkindly, but in the way of a man noticing a thing in another that he would never trouble himself." Holmes thanked her and said no more upon the subject, but I observed that for the remainder of that day he seemed disposed to occupy himself with matters that appeared on their face to have little to do with shoes, or clay, or burned parchment. He spent above an hour in conversation with Miss Vale in the morning room, the door of which stood ajar, so that I caught only fragments of their talk as I passed. Something of her uncle's temper, something of the management of the household accounts, something, once, that brought a flush of feeling to her composed face before she mastered it again. It was not until the late afternoon, the light was failing, and the lamps were being lit throughout the house, that Holmes drew me aside and gave me some of what he'd learnt. "Miss Vale has been more candid with me today than at our first meeting, Watson. I think she does not yet perceive the full bearing of what she has told me." We had withdrawn to the small library adjoining the study, and Holmes stood with his back to the fire, his hands clasped behind him, in the attitude he commonly adopted when setting out the threads of a case for my benefit. "She tells me that her uncle's manner of humiliating those indebted to him was not confined to the formal business of his ledgers. He took, it seems, kind of pleasure." She used the word herself, though reluctantly, in reminding such persons of their dependence in small ways, at unexpected moments. Remark at table. An inquiry after some matter the debtor would rather not have raised in company. Gift bestowed with such pointed generosity that it became, in effect, a reproach, a but scarcely a novel one among men of his profession. Scarcely novel, no, but Miss Vale tells me further that this habit was not reserved for those outside the household. She has herself been its object on more than one occasion, reminded, gently and publicly, that her position here depended entirely upon her uncle's goodwill, and might be altered at his pleasure. And she tells me, moreover, that Nathan Wills has been its object far more often than herself, and far more cruelly. In what way? It appears that Wills's father was, some 15 years since, a tenant farmer of modest but independent means, until a series of misfortunes, a bad harvest, the death of a horse, the usual catalogue of small disasters that afflict such men, obliged him to borrow from Vale. The debt was not large, but it was managed in the manner we have already observed, and within a few years the farm was lost entirely. The elder Wills did not long survive the loss of it. His son, left with neither property nor prospects, taken into Vale's service as a kind of charity. Though Miss Vale assures me that her uncle never once permitted the young man to forget the nature, that charity, nor its price. Then Wills has every reason to hate the man, I said, and every reason, too, to wish destroyed any document that perpetuated the same system which ruined his own father. Every reason in the world, Holmes agreed. And yet, Watson, I find myself troubled by something which Miss Vale let fall almost in passing, and which I think she herself did not fully grasp the significance of. What was that? She tells me that some weeks ago, she could not be precise as to the date, believed it to have been shortly before the registration notice was sent regarding the Harbury mortgage. Her uncle spoke to her, in some irritation, of a discrepancy he had discovered in certain accounts, and remarked that he should have to have it out with Wills directly. He had not yet done so. She thought little of it at the time, supposing it to be some trifling clerical error of the kind her uncle was forever discovering and forever exaggerating. But this evening, going through certain private memoranda which Mr. Felwood has placed at my disposal, I found a draft letter, unfinished, undated, but in Vale's own hand, addressed to an agency in London which supplies clerks and secretaries to private households. A letter seeking Wills's replacement? A letter making inquiries in that direction, certainly, though framed in the cautious, non-committal language of a man not yet decided. It speaks of certain irregularities, not yet fully investigated, the desirability of having a more experienced hand available, should circumstances render a change advisable. It is dated, or rather, bears no date, but I am satisfied, from the paper and the ink, that it was written within the fortnight before Vale's death. Sat for a moment, turning this over in my mind. Then Will stood not only to lose his place, I said slowly, but to lose it under some cloud of suspected dishonesty, a suspicion that might follow him to whatever situation he sought thereafter, from a man whose word in matters of business would carry very great weight in the county. Just so. And consider, Watson, what such a man, already stripped once of everything by Vale's methods, and now threatened with a second and perhaps more complete ruin, might feel upon discovering, in the course of his duties, a document which proved that those very methods rested upon a legal flaw, document whose destruction would not only spare the Harburys, but might also, in the confusion that must follow Vale's discovery of the loss, provide some cover for whatever irregularities Vale believed he had found. You think the two matters connected, then? The threatened dismissal, burned deed? I think it very possible that they are the same matter, viewed from two directions, said Holmes. But I will confess to you, Watson, that I am not yet satisfied. There is something in this case, some element I have not yet laid my hand upon, that does not fit comfortably within the explanation now suggesting itself, however neatly its several parts seem to interlock. Greed, I could understand. Revenge, even, taken cold and calculated, I could understand. But there is something else here, some note of shame or grief, that runs beneath the whole affair, and that I cannot yet account for by either greed or revenge alone. He fell silent, staring into the fire with that look of inward concentration, which I had learned never to interrupt. And at last he said, in a voice so low I scarcely caught the words, "The motive is not greed alone, Watson. There is shame woven through this affair, and I think, before we are done, we shall find that shame has played as great a part in it as fear or anger or want ever did. He said no more that evening, and I, for my part, was left to ponder, as I made ready for bed, what manner of shame could attach itself to a man so wronged as Nathan Wills appeared to have been, and why Holmes, who saw so much, should find in that shame a mystery deeper than any he had yet uncovered. Chapter 7. The Convenient Solution. We were at breakfast the following morning, when the sound of wheels upon the gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Bradstreet, a stout, businesslike officer of the county constabulary, whom I had not previously met. Holmes greeted him with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "Mr. Holmes," said he, stamping the cold from his boots in the hall, "I had heard you were down here, and I confess I am glad of it, for it saves me the trouble of writing to you. The case is closed, sir, or as good as closed, and I thought you would wish to hear it from me directly, rather than from the local paper." "Closed," said Holmes, tone of mild interest that gave away nothing of what I knew he must be feeling. "Pray come in, Inspector, and tell us how." We withdrew to the study, where Bradstreet, evidently pleased with himself, laid out his conclusions with the satisfaction of a man who has performed a difficult sum, and arrived at a tidy answer. "It's Major Harbury, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I'm sorry to say it, for he's a gentleman well thought of hereabouts, and I take no pleasure in it. But the facts speak for themselves, and a policeman must follow facts where they lead, however unwelcome." "By all means, let us hear the facts," said Holmes, seating himself and regarding the inspector with an air of grave attention. "Well, sir, it's this way. We know the Major came to this house on the night Mr. Vale died, and that he came on a desperate errand, to beg more time on a debt that would otherwise ruin him and his family entire. We know he was refused. Now, Mr. Vale was not a young man, and his heart was known to be weak. Dr. Ainsworth had warned him of it more than once. I put it to you, Mr. Holmes, that words passed between these two gentlemen on that night. Hard words, perhaps, on both sides, and that the strain of the encounter was too much for Mr. Vale's heart, and he was taken with the seizure that killed him, then and there, before the Major's eyes. A tragic accident, then, rather than a crime. That is what I believe happened, sir, so far as the death itself is concerned. But here is where it grows darker. The Major finds himself alone with a dead man who holds, in this very room, the document that will ruin the Harbury family within the month. What does he do? He knows where the deed is kept. He has had dealings enough with Vale to know the man's habits. He takes it, and he burns it, here in this grate, meaning to make it appear that the fire caught accidentally in the confusion, and that the deed was lost along with whatever else might burn. Then, his nerve failing him, he leaves by the garden door, not the front entrance, so as not to be seen, and in his haste, going out by that way in the dark, he puts his elbow or his stick through the study window and does not stop to explain it. And the household discovers all this only afterward. Just so, sir. The fire is found, the body is found, the broken window is found, and at first it all looks like nothing more than a sad accident, which is what everyone, naturally enough, was glad to believe. It is only on closer examination. Your examination, Mr. Holmes, if I may say so, for it was your interest in the matter that set me looking again, that the burned deed takes on its true significance, and once that is understood, the rest follows. You have spoken to Major Harbury of this theory? I have, sir, only this morning, before coming here. I will say this for him. He did not deny the visit, nor the quarrel, nor that he left by the garden way. He says he found Vale already collapsed when the words grew hot between them, and that he did nothing more than try, in vain to revive him, before losing his head entirely and fleeing the house. He denies touching any document. But he is an old soldier, Mr. Holmes, and not a practised liar, and I could see that the suggestion struck him hard. Harder, I think, than an innocent man's surprise at a false accusation. Believe, sir, that somewhere beneath that denial the Major knows he has done a thing he cannot now undo, and that the knowledge of it is eating at him. And the mud traces near the study window, of which I understand something was made. Garden mud, sir, consistent with the path he took in leaving. Nothing more remarkable than that. I confess that, hearing the inspector's account laid out in this orderly fashion, I felt the case had indeed the appearance of a closed book. The motive was clear, the opportunity established, the physical evidence, so far as the inspector had troubled to examine it, not inconsistent with his theory. Even the broken window, which Holmes had marked as significant, found here a ready explanation. I glanced at my friend, expecting some sign of the quiet triumph he so often displayed, when a case resolved itself along the lines his own reasoning had anticipated. But I saw instead only that fixed inward look I had observed the previous evening, as of a man listening for some sound that others could not hear. "You intend to bring a charge against the Major, then?" Holmes asked at length. "I have spoken with him of the gravity of his position, sir, and I believe, though nothing is yet settled, that he is disposed to make a full statement this afternoon. Between ourselves, Mr. Holmes, I think the poor gentleman is half persuaded of his own guilt already. He kept saying, when I put it to him, that he might as well have done it himself, for all the good his denials would do him, which is not, perhaps, the language of a man with a clear conscience, however we read it. When Bradstreet had taken his leave, well satisfied, I think, with the reception his theory had received, for Holmes had offered no contradiction, only a few questions of detail which the inspector answered without difficulty. I found the household, when we returned to the breakfast room, transformed by an atmosphere of profound relief. Miss Vale's composure had given way to something gentler. The Reverend Brooke spoke, for the first time since our arrival, of matters quite unconnected with the tragedy. Even Mrs. Greaves, bringing in fresh coffee, wore an expression less forbidding than I had yet seen upon her. Only Major Harbury himself was absent, having withdrawn, Mrs. Greaves told us, to his room. And only Nathan Wills, I observed, sat as silent and as pale as he had sat at every meal since our arrival, though whether from relief, from some other emotion altogether, I could not then have said. Holmes ate almost nothing. When the meal was over, he asked Mrs. Greaves whether he might have the use of the study for the remainder of the day. Undisturbed, and there, so far as I could tell, he remained until long past dark, seated before the cold hearth, the fragment of burned parchment in its paper wrapping upon his knee, and the poker from the fire irons across his lap, turning it over and over in his hands, as though it were the one object in all that house which had not yet finished speaking to him. I looked in upon him once, toward 11, found him in precisely the attitude in which I had left him hours before. He did not look up as I entered, but said, in a voice so quiet I might almost have imagined it, "The household is satisfied, Watson. The inspector is satisfied. Major Harbury, I think, very near to satisfying himself, out of sheer weariness, that he is guilty of a thing he did not do. It wants only my satisfaction now. And I confess, my dear fellow, that this poker has not yet given it to me." Chapter 8. The detail no one saw. I woke the next morning to find Holmes already gone from our room, and upon descending I learned from Mrs. Greaves that he had risen before dawn and gone out, taking with him, of all things, small spirit lamp from the chemical case he had brought from London, and the poker from the study fire. She delivered this information with the wary disapproval of a woman who had seen a great many odd things in the course of a long career in service, but had not yet grown reconciled to any of them. He returned a little before 9, his boots wet to the ankle, and his face wearing an expression I knew well. The look of a man who has, at last, found the thread he sought, was already tracing it forward to its end. "Come into the study, Watson," said he, "and bring your notebook. I think the time has come to set this matter in order, though I shall want 1 or 2 further words with Mrs. Greaves before I am wholly satisfied. Post." When we were alone, he laid upon the desk the fragment of burned parchment, now somewhat further examined, and beside it a second fragment, smaller, so blackened that I could make out nothing of its surface at all. "This second piece," said Holmes, "I obtained this morning from the ashes that were swept from this grate 3 days ago, and which Mrs. Greaves, host, in the manner of housekeepers everywhere, had not yet had carried away, but had set aside in the ash bin behind the kitchen, against some future use in the garden. It is a fortunate habit, Watson, and one I have had occasion to bless more than once. Now, observe the 2 fragments together." I looked, and saw that while the first fragment, the one discovered beneath the fender, showed that curious, bluish discoloration along one edge, the second showed nothing of the kind. It was uniformly black, charred through and through, none of that pale, ground in clay we had remarked before. The difference is significant. The difference, Watson, is everything. Consider, if this document had been thrown, whole, into a fire that broke out accidentally among Vale's papers, every fragment of it that survived at all should bear some trace of having lain in the same fire, under the same conditions, for the same length of time. But here we have one fragment that was demonstrably exposed to wet clay before ever it burned, and another from the same document that shows no such exposure whatsoever, and is burned through far more completely. What does it mean? It means, I think, that the document was not burned all at once, in one place, but in at least 2 distinct stages, or perhaps that only a portion of it was carried to Riverside, while the remainder was burned elsewhere, more thoroughly, and the ashes of both afterward combined and brought to this room together. Psst. Either way, Watson, it confirms what I had already begun to suspect, that this fire was built, piece by piece, like a stage setting, by someone who understood very well what conclusions an examination of the ashes alone might yield, and who took pains, therefore, that no single examination should yield too much. He turned next to the poker, which lay across the desk, held it up, so that the grey morning light fell along its length. "This poker, Watson, was cleaned and polished within the last few days. Mrs. Greaves confirms that it is her own invariable practice to do so each morning as part of the ordinary care of the hearth, and that she did so on the morning after Vale's death, along with the rest of the fire-irons, before ever the police arrived to examine the room. Natural enough proceeding, and one that has, I do not doubt, destroyed evidence in 100 cases before this one. But observe, here, near the handle, where the polish has not been renewed so thoroughly as along the shaft. I took the poker and examined it as he directed, and saw, in the dim, unburnished metal near the grip, a faint residue, greasy and faintly discoloured, quite different from the bright steel of the rest. What is that? Wax, Watson. Candle wax, mixed, I think, with something else that I have not yet fully identified. though I have my suspicions. Now, poker is handled in the ordinary way, with a bare hand, or perhaps through the folds of an apron if the fire is very hot. But this residue lies precisely where a man's fingers would close upon the handle if he wished to use the poker for some purpose, raking ashes, perhaps, or arranging them, without leaving upon the metal the clear marks of his own skin. "A glove," I said slowly, "or a cloth soaked in melted wax and wrapped about the hand. A crude precaution, Watson, but an effective one, and one that would occur most readily to a person familiar with candles and sealing wax as tools of his daily work. Gentleman's valet might think of it. So, too, might a clergyman, accustomed to the vestry. But so, above all, might a secretary. Desk is never without its stick of sealing wax, for the closing of letters and the authentication of documents." I sat down rather heavily in the chair beside the desk, for I began at last to see the shape of the thing toward which Holmes had been working these 3 days past. "Wills," I said, "let us reason it through together, Watson, for I think you have very nearly reached it yourself. We know that the burned deed bore traces of river clay, pressed into it while wet, which tells us it was carried to, or from, the riverside before it was destroyed. We know that Wills's second-best shoes bear traces of that same clay, though Mrs. Greaves assures us he has had no occasion, in the ordinary way, to go near the river these many weeks. We know that Wills stood to lose everything, his place, his character, his whole future, through Vale's discovered irregularities, whatever they may prove to be. We know that the file on the Harbury mortgage, which Wills alone maintained, is incomplete, in just the manner that suggests deliberate concealment. And we know now that the fire in this grate was not the work of a desperate man acting in panic, snatching up papers and thrusting them into existing flames, but the work of a careful man, working perhaps over some little time, who understood the value of ashes as evidence, and took pains to manufacture exactly the kind of ashes that would tell the story he wished told. "But the broken window," I objected, remembering the inspector's theory. "Surely that points to Major Harbury, who left by the garden way that night." "The broken window," said Holmes, "points to whoever broke it, and I do not think, Watson, was broken from within by a man leaving in haste at all. I examined it again this morning by the light of day, and I find that the smaller fragments of glass, chiefly without the house, lie upon the gravel of the path, not within upon the carpet we should expect if the blow had come from inside. The window, Watson, was broken from the outside, looking in, and I think it was broken not on the night of Vale's death at all, but on some earlier occasion, and has simply never been remarked upon until the household, searching for some explanation of strange sounds heard that night, seized upon it, and assumed, naturally enough, that the two events must be connected. Then what was the sound Mrs. Greaves heard? I think, Watson, that the sound Mrs. Greaves heard was very much what she described. The sound of something heavy falling, and very little else. I think Edmund Vale died, that night, very much as Dr. Ainsworth supposed, of a seizure of the heart, sudden and natural, brought on, perhaps, by some shock or exertion, but by no hand raised against him. I think he died alone in this room, that some considerable time passed, an hour perhaps more, before anyone else entered it, and I think that in that interval someone who had been waiting, near at hand, for just such an opportunity, someone who knew Vale's habits and his hiding places and the hour at which the household generally retired, came to this room, found him dead and understood in that moment that the thing he had planned to do quietly and at his leisure might now be done at once, and laid forever beyond suspicion, beneath the cover a death that would draw every eye toward itself, and away from a few handfuls of burning paper in an empty grate, he gathered up the 2 fragments of parchment, and the poker with its faint trace of wax, and laid them carefully together upon the desk. A man might arrange the pieces of a puzzle before setting them, at last, into their final places. "There is one thing more I require, Watson, before I lay this matter before the household," said he. I require 5 minutes alone with Nathan Wills, and I think, from the look of him this morning, that he has been waiting almost as long as I have for someone to ask him the right question." Chapter 9. Holmes explains the crime. Holmes did not, in the event, take Wills aside privately, as he had at first proposed. Instead, he requested that the household assemble in the study that afternoon. Miss Vale, Major Harbury, the Reverend Brooke, Mrs. Greaves, and Wills himself, together with Inspector Bradstreet, who was sent for, and arrived within the hour, evidently puzzled, and not a little put out, being summoned back to a case he had believed concluded. It was a strange gathering, that room which had been the scene of so much that was hidden. The afternoon light was already failing, and Mrs. Greaves had lit the lamps, so that the company sat in a yellow glow that softened, without quite concealing, the anxiety upon every face. Major Harbury, who had emerged from his seclusion, looking 10 years older than when we had first met him, sat near the window. Miss Vale beside the empty hearth, the Reverend Brooke a little apart, his hands folded as though in church. Wills stood. He would not sit. Holmes twice invited him to do so. Near the desk, very pale, his eyes fixed upon nothing. "I have asked you here," Holmes began, "because I believe the true circumstances of Mr. Vale's death, and of the destruction of the Harbury mortgage, are now clear to me, though I confess they are circumstances very different from those which Inspector Bradstreet has, until this morning, had every reason to accept." Bradstreet stirred uneasily, but said nothing. "Let me say at once," Holmes continued, "that I do not believe Mr. Vale died, other than as Dr. Ainsworth supposed, of a sudden failure of the heart, occurring naturally, and without violence offered by any hand. Major Harbury's account of that night, which the inspector has been disposed to doubt, I believe to be substantially true in every particular. He came here in distress. He found Mr. Vale already taken ill, perhaps already beyond help. He attempted in his agitation to be of some use. Finding he could not, he lost his composure entirely and left by the nearest way, which happened to be the garden door. The mud upon that path, which has been thought to implicate him in the destruction of the deed, implicates him in nothing more than what he has himself confessed: hasty and frightened departure from a house in which he could do no further good." A faint colour came into the Major's grey face. He said nothing. "The deed, however," Holmes went on, "was not destroyed that night at all, or rather was not destroyed then. For the first time, if I may put it so. It had already been removed from this house some days, perhaps some weeks, before Mr. Vale's death, taken from a hiding-place known, I believe, to one person only, besides Mr. Vale himself, carried to a spot beside the river, where it was concealed, wrapped against the damp, against some future occasion." "Concealed," said Inspector Bradstreet slowly. "You mean it was stolen, Mr. Holmes?" "Stolen and hidden before ever the old gentleman died. I mean precisely that, and I mean also that the person who took it had not, at first, intended to destroy it at all, or had not finally resolved upon destruction, but kept it by him, against the day when he might find the courage, or the occasion, to use it as he saw fit. Perhaps to destroy it quietly, at some safe distance of time from its removal, so that no one should connect the two events. Perhaps, though this I cannot say with certainty, to use it in some other way entirely, should circumstances require. He paused and turned very deliberately toward the secretary. "Mr. Wills," said he, not unkindly, "plus, I think the time has come for you to tell us the rest, in your own words. I believe you will find it easier than you suppose, and I believe, moreover, that nothing you can tell us now will alter the essential facts so much as you fear." For a long moment Wills did not speak. He stood quite still, his thin hands gripping the edge of the desk. And I thought, watching him, I had never seen a man's face express so plainly the relief of a burden about to be set down, mingled with the dread of the setting down itself, poured. "You are right, Mr. Holmes," he said at last, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, though it grew steadier as he went on. "I took the deed, took it 3 weeks ago, from a tin box that Mr. Vale kept hidden behind a loose stone in the old ice-house by the river, a place I had discovered, by chance, years ago, and that he never knew I had discovered. I had read the deed, Mr. Holmes, more carefully than ever Mr. Vale had troubled to read it himself, for it was I who had drawn up the renewal notice, and in doing so I found—" He stopped and swallowed, began again. "I found that the original mortgage, drawn 15 years ago, contained an error in the description of the boundary, an error that, under the law, would render the whole instrument void, if it were ever brought before a court upon the renewal. Mr. Vale did not know of this error. I do not believe the original solicitor who drew the deed knew of it either. I alone knew it, because I alone had occasion to compare the deed, word for word, against the old parish first survey, in preparing the renewal papers." "And you said nothing?" Holmes prompted gently. "I said nothing, sir, because I did not at first know what to do. If I told Mr. Vale, he would have the deed redrawn, at once the error corrected, and the Harburys ruined beyond any hope, with my own hand the instrument of it. If I told the Harburys, or Mr. Felwood, betrayed my employer's confidence, and lost my place at once, with no character to take to any other situation. Mr. I knew, suspected me already of some dishonesty in the accounts, though I had done nothing wrong there, nothing at all. It was only that he had grown suspicious of everyone, these last months, as old men sometimes do. I knew he meant to dismiss me, Mr. Holmes. I had seen the letters he was writing. And so you took the deed." "I took it, meaning—" "I hardly know what I meant, sir, truly. Told myself I would think what to do. I kept it by the river, in the old waterproof case the fishermen use, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden among the willow roots, where I had played as a boy, before ever my father lost everything to that man. And then, 3 nights ago, I went to fetch it. I had resolved at last to burn it, and have done, whatever the consequence to myself, and I came back to the house by the garden way, meaning to go up to my room unseen. There I found—" His voice failed him entirely for a moment. "I found Mr. Vale, sir, lying before this hearth, and I knew at once that he was dead. Room was very silent. Even Bradstreet, I think, had forgotten for the moment that he was a policeman. I do not ask you to believe that I felt nothing," Wills went on, more quietly still. "I had hated him, Mr. Holmes. God forgive me, I had hated him for years, for what he did to my father, for what he did to people like the Harburys, for what he did, in small ways, every day, to me. And yet seeing him there, an old man, alone, dead upon his own hearthstone, I felt nothing of triumph. I felt only that everything had become, suddenly, very simple and very terrible. I understood in that moment that no one need ever know the deed had been taken at all, that I might burn it here now, in this very grate, and that its loss would be set down to the fire that must surely be supposed to have broken out in the confusion, his death. I built the fire myself, Mr. Holmes, with paper from the waste basket and shavings from the kindling box, and I burned the deed in it, piece by piece, and when it was consumed, I raked the ashes with the poker, wearing my gloves smeared with sealing wax against the soot, so that no mark of my hand should remain upon the metal. And then I broke the lamp glass upon the hearth, to account for the smell of smoke, and I went to my room. And I waited until Sarah's cry brought the household running, and I came down with the rest, as though I, too, had only just learned what had occurred. "The shock of finding him dead," said Holmes quietly, "did not then cause his seizure. It came after, sir. I am as certain of that as I can be of anything. He was already gone when I came into the room. I did not kill him, Mr. Holmes. I swear it before God. Whatever else I have done, I did not kill him. But I have let an innocent man stand accused these last 2 days, said nothing. And that, I think, is a thing I shall not easily forgive myself, whatever the law decides to do with me." He stopped, stood looking at none of us, his hands at last quite still upon the desk, and Holmes, after a moment, said, in a voice gentler than I had often heard him use, "The law may distinguish poorly, Mr. Wills, between malice and desperation. Logic cannot afford such blindness. And I do not think, when this matter comes to be examined by those whose business it is to weigh such things, that the distinction will be lost upon them as readily as you fear." Chapter 10. Watson's reflection. Inspector Bradstreet took Wills into custody that same evening, though I observed that he did so with none of the brisk satisfaction he had displayed 2 days before in laying out his theory of Major Harbury's guilt. He was, I think, an honest officer, and not at an unfeeling one. The tale we had heard had plainly moved him, as it had moved us all. He spoke of the matter, deep as he led Wills out to the trap that was to carry them to the village, in terms that suggested he himself entertained considerable doubt as to what charge, if any, could properly be sustained. Theft of a document already void in law, he observed, was a curious sort of theft. And as to the destruction of evidence in a death that proved, upon every medical examination, to have been entirely natural, he confessed himself uncertain what offence, precisely, had been committed at all. "It will go to the assizes, I suppose," he said to Holmes. We stood in the cold of the drive, watching the lamps of the trap dwindle down the avenue. "But I should not be surprised, Mr. Holmes, if a sensible jury, hearing the whole of it as we have heard it tonight, found itself a good deal more inclined to leniency than the bare facts, set down in a charge sheet, might lead one to expect. There is a difference, sir, between a man who steals for gain and a man who steals, because he can no longer bear to watch the same wrong done to others that was once done to him. I do not know that the law has a name for that difference, but I think most men would know it, if they saw it." "I think so too, Inspector Holmes," said Hissus, "and I think you have put the matter better than many a barrister could." The days that followed were quieter, and in their quietness, I thought, a kind of healing began that the household had perhaps not known it needed. Mr. Felwood returned, closeted himself for the better part of a day, with Miss Vale, and with a representative of the Harbury family, examining with very great care the whole of Edmund Vale's outstanding claims against his neighbours. And I understood, before we left Blackthorn Hall, Miss Vale, now mistress of the estate in her own right, had resolved to release a number of these claims altogether, crossed, and to revise the terms of others so substantially that several families in the parish, the Harburys among them, would find themselves, for the first time in years, able to look toward the future without dread. "It will cost me a good deal," she said to Holmes, on the morning of our departure, with something of her old composure restored, though softened now by an evident relief. "But I find, Mr. Holmes, that I had rather be poorer and sleep easily than richer and lie awake as my uncle so often did, working out, I do not doubt, fresh ways to be feared by people who had done him no wrong. I do not know that I can undo what he did, but I can stop doing it further, and that, I think, is something." Major Harbury, for his part, sought us out before we left, shook Holmes's hand with a warmth that spoke more than any words could have done. "I had very nearly persuaded myself I was guilty of something, Mr. Holmes," he said, with a rueful smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Man under suspicion long enough begins to wonder whether his own memory can be trusted, whether, in some moment he cannot recall, he might not have done the thing he is accused of. I am grateful to you, sir, for more than the saving of my estate. You have given me back the certainty of my own conscience, and I do not know that there is a debt in the world heavier to repay than that one." "There is no debt, Major," said Holmes, "save the one you owe to your own good sense, in not confessing to a crime merely because it was easier than continuing to deny it. That is a temptation, I find, to which more men succumb than the world generally supposes, and resisting it is no small thing. The Reverend Brooke, too, had a word for us. Not of thanks, precisely, but of something more like confession. I have been examining my own conduct these last days, Mr. Holmes," said he, as we waited for the carriage that was to take us to the station, "and I find it does not bear examination very well. I knew something of what Wills suffered, and I said nothing, because to speak would have meant acknowledging my own debt to Vale, and the shame of that seemed, at the time, heavier thing to bear than another man's silent misery. I see now that I mistook cowardice for discretion, and I shall have a good deal to set right in my own small way before I am easy in my mind again." "A man who recognises the difference, Mr. Brooke," said Holmes, "has already begun to set it right. I should not be too harsh with yourself. The world has more cowards in it than villains, by a very great margin, and a good deal more good done, in the end, by cowards grown ashamed than villains ever do at all." We took the afternoon train from the little station at Endersley, and, as it carried us back toward London, through, countryside already softening, toward evening, I found myself turning over in my mind the whole strange history of the case. The burned deed, broken window that had broken nothing, the clay that had travelled from a river bank to a hearth, and told its story to no one but Holmes and Wills himself, whose crime, if crime it could be called, had been born not of avarice, but of a wound inflicted upon him before he was old enough to defend against it, and never since allowed to heal. "You are very thoughtful, Watson," said Holmes, breaking in upon my reverie. "I was thinking, Holmes, how strange a thing it is that the law should find it so much easier to punish a man for destroying a worthless piece of parchment than it ever found it to punish the man who made that parchment a weapon in the first place. The law, Watson, is a blunt instrument, fashioned for blunt purposes, and we should not ask of it the subtlety that belongs properly to conscience, and to history, and to time. Vale broke no law in 15 years of patient cruelty. Indeed, he was scrupulous in his way, never to break it. Wills broke a law, perhaps, 3 weeks of desperate concealment. And yet I think, when this case comes to be remembered, it will not be Wills's name that men recall with the greater unease. The fog had begun to close in again as we drew nearer to London, wrapping the fields and the scattered lights of farmhouses in that soft grey obscurity I had come to associate. After so many years, the city that was our home. And I took out my notebook, as I often did at the close of such an inquiry, and set down, while the impressions of it were still fresh upon me, some record of what we had seen and heard. In the records of my friend Sherlock Holmes, there are cases wherein crime emerged not from wickedness alone, but from the slow corrosion of human dignity under fear and power. Holmes never permitted sentiment to obscure truth. Yet neither did he mistake truth for cruelty. In that distinction lay the greatness of his reason. And it was, I think, that same distinction which Bradstreet and Major Harbury, even the gentle, troubled Reverend Brooke, had each, in their own way, begun that winter to understand a little better than before. The lamps of London rose to meet us out of the fog, and Holmes, beside me, had already taken up some pamphlet upon medieval seals. His mind trod, I did not doubt, already turning toward whatever problem the city held in store for us next. But I sat a while, longer with my notebook closed upon my knee, thinking of a young man's careful, unhurried hand, of the years of silent grievance that hand had concealed so well, and of how very near in this world the keeping of a secret may come to the keeping of a wound.